The sun had barely risen over Shadowmere. Zephyr Aldridge stepped out of his small cottage, mug of lukewarm coffee in hand. Most mornings began like this, quiet, solitary. But today was different. The moment he checked his phone, he saw a notification that made his heart skip a beat. The subject line in his inbox read, "Clue for my murder." It was from Erilyn Bannister, Shadowmere's librarian, and perhaps the only other person in town who shared Zephyr's love for books. The body of the email contained just one line, a library call number. Frowning, Zephyr tapped the screen, hoping the email was some kind of joke, but it was real. No greetings, no closing remarks, just that ominous line. Despite his usual methodical morning routine, he felt an urge to head directly to the library. He couldn't shake the unease gnawing at him. Why would Erilyn send him such a strange message? He tossed his mug into the sink, grabbed his coat, and walked briskly through the mist-filled streets toward Shadowmere Library. The grand old building, barely visible in the gray morning light. Zephyr arrived at the library and noticed that the usually welcoming space felt colder, emptier. He'd been inside this building countless times, yet something was different. He pushed open the door, which surprisingly was unlocked. "Erilyn?" he called out, his voice echoing through the empty room. Silence. No soft shuffling of pages, no distant hum of an old record player, just an eerie stillness. He took a few hesitant steps inside, scanning the shelves lined with books whose spines held decades of history. His eyes were drawn to the circulation desk where he often found Erilyn, meticulously recording inventory. But today, she wasn't bustling about with her usual energy. She was slumped over her desk, head resting against her arms, as if she'd simply fallen asleep. Zephyr's stomach tightened as he approached her. "Erilyn?" His voice dropped to a whisper, betraying the fear he felt. Gently, he reached out and touched her shoulder, cold and lifeless. He pulled his hand back, horrified. It was clear now. Erilyn was dead. Stunned and overwhelmed, Zephyr stumbled back from the desk. His mind raced, connecting dots he hadn't yet fully processed. The email, the cryptic call number. Why would Erilyn send such a message if she'd felt unwell or suspected her own death? Summoning his composure, he remembered the call number. 823.91 ban. He knew this library like the back of his hand, and the number led him to a secluded corner where older books, ones less often borrowed, collected dust. With slow steps, Zephyr made his way to the shelf. His fingers brushed over faded spines until they landed on an old leather-bound book, its title barely visible under layers of wear. Murder by the Book. For a moment he hesitated, heart pounding. He pulled the book from the shelf and opened it carefully, flipping through the brittle pages. His eyes widened when a loose, handwritten note fell out. He picked it up, unfolding it with trembling fingers. There are things even books can't tell. The cryptic note did little to calm him. Instead, it planted more questions. Who would Erilyn be hiding secrets from? And why warn him, specifically? His heart pounded in his chest as he tucked the note into his pocket, his mind whirling with possibilities. Before Zephyr could gather his thoughts, the door swung open, and Officer Sealan Fallow entered the library. His tall, imposing frame cut an intimidating figure, and his brow furrowed when he noticed Zephyr's pale, shaken expression. "Zephyr," Sealan greeted cautiously, his eyes scanning the room before landing on Erilyn's body slumped over the desk. His expression softened, but he maintained his composure. "What happened here?" I don't know. I came in and found her like this," Zephyr replied, struggling to keep his voice steady. Kalen examined Erilyn's body briefly before stepping back, his initial analysis seemingly leading him to dismiss foul play. "She was old, Zephyr. It could have been a heart attack. I know you cared about her, but these things happen." Zephyr, clutching the book and note behind his back, bit his lip. He felt foolish voicing his suspicions, especially with only a call number and a vague message to back them up. "I understand, but..." He hesitated, weighing his words. "She emailed me something strange last night. A clue for her murder." Sealan's brow raised in surprise, but it was clear he wasn't taking it seriously. "Maybe she was just being dramatic," he replied, dismissing it with a wave. "Sometimes people have a sense of their own mortality and want to leave a little mystery behind." Zephyr bit his tongue. Erilyn wasn't dramatic, she was thoughtful and precise. There was no way she'd send an email like that on a whim. Still, he could tell that Kalen had made up his mind, and any further objections would fall on deaf ears. After Seelan left, urging Zephyr to take care and let the paramedics handle the scene, Zephyr felt trapped in a fog of grief and uncertainty. He wandered aimlessly through the library, his fingers trailing along the bookshelves, searching for answers he knew he wouldn't find among the rows of fiction and biographies. Erilyn had spent most of her life in these walls, protecting the library's secrets. Her presence lingered in the smell of old paper and leather, in the polished wood of the shelves she had dusted each morning. But now, with her gone, a disturbing question echoed in Zephyr's mind. What did she mean by clue for my murder? The cryptic message, the note inside the book, it all felt too coincidental. And yet, with no one to share his suspicions, he feared he might lose the fragile thread that connected him to whatever truth Erilyn had tried to reveal. He pulled out the note again, rereading the words. There are things even books can't tell. Something about it felt unfinished, like there was more to uncover. Zephyr's gaze drifted back toward the dusty rows of books. Erilyn might be gone, but her secrets were still here, buried in the very place she had loved. Zephyr stayed late into the evening, long after the paramedics had come and gone. Alone in the library, surrounded by silent, unfeeling books, he began his own quiet investigation. He scanned every shelf, looking for any unusual signs, any hidden clues Erilyn might have left behind. As the hours passed, the library took on an eerie stillness, the kind that played tricks on his mind. Shadows seemed to shift with each flickering light, and the weight of the library's silence pressed down on him. In the quiet, he could almost hear Erilyn's voice, guiding him through the stacks. Just when he was ready to call it a night, something caught his eye, a faint scratch on the inside of the shelf where he'd found the book. It was so subtle that he almost missed it, but once he noticed, he couldn't unsee it. 3 letters etched faintly into the wood. In the dim light, Zephyr puzzled over the letters, convinced they were somehow connected to Erilyn's last message. They could have been initials, or perhaps a hint for something he'd yet to discover. Exhausted but determined, he promised himself he would return the next day. Erilyn's last words had planted a seed of doubt in his mind that refused to fade. As he locked the library doors and stepped into the chilly night, he looked back at the building, now a dark silhouette against the sky. His resolve hardened. If there was more to Erilyn's death, he owed it to her to find out. He would follow her final clue until he uncovered every truth buried within those walls. The next morning, Zephyr returned to the library, feeling a sense of duty to protect Erilyn's legacy and to uncover what she had tried to communicate. It was only a few hours after sunrise, but Jessamine Everhart, one of the library's volunteers and Erilyn's longtime friend, was already inside, shelving books. Jessamine's face lit up with a sad smile when she saw him. Zephyr, I heard the news. It's so surreal. I thought Erilyn would live forever. Zephyr forced a small smile but felt the weight of his curiosity. I was here yesterday, found her myself, he said, trying to gauge Jessamine's reaction. Do you remember her mentioning anything unusual? Maybe something she was working on? Jessamine shook her head, her face clouding with confusion. Not that I recall. Erilyn was always reading something. She practically lived in those archives, but I don't think she mentioned anything specific. Just her usual curiosity about the town's history, you know? Something about Jessamine's response seemed genuine, but it was clear she knew little about Erilyn's last days. As she returned to her tasks, Zephyr made a mental note to seek out anyone else who might have been close to Erilyn, especially those who might understand her cryptic warning. Later that day, Zephyr found Evadne Rayburn browsing in the local bookstore, flipping through a tattered copy of a historical novel. Evadne had known Erilyn for decades, sharing a particular interest in rare books and history. Evadne, he greeted, nodding in acknowledgement. Evadne looked up, surprised. Oh, Zephyr, I assume you've heard about Erilyn. Such a dreadful loss. She was such a particular sort of person. She said it in a way that made Zephyr pause, as if Evadne had more she was holding back. She was, he agreed, choosing his words carefully. Actually, she emailed me something strange right before she passed away. A call number from the library. Didn't mean much to me, but I can't shake the feeling that it was important to her. A flicker of something crossed Evadne's face, a flash of concern, Or was it recognition? Interesting, she said slowly, placing the book back on the shelf. Erilyn was always getting wrapped up in her own mysteries. Sometimes, I wondered if she didn't dig a little too deep into the past. Zephyr tried to hide his curiosity, but Evadne's words only fueled it. What do you mean, too deep? Nothing more than any of us. Just that sometimes she got fixated on things others would have left alone, she replied cryptically. Erilyn was a friend, but she was peculiar. Perhaps she thought she'd uncovered something worth hiding, but if she did, it was her business, not mine. The ambiguity of Evadne's response left Zephyr with more questions than answers, but he could sense she was holding back. Deciding to let the subject drop for now, he thanked her and left, already forming plans for his next steps. Zephyr's next stop was the Shadowmere archives, where local records were kept, meticulously preserved from the town's founding. He hoped the historical documents might offer a glimpse into whatever Erilyn was researching. The archivist, a reserved man named Torin Voss, gave him a wary glance as Zephyr entered. Zephyr Aldridge. Not often we see you here, he remarked. Torin, I'm actually looking into something Erilyn was studying. Any chance you've noticed her here lately? Zephyr asked, trying to keep his tone casual. Torin considered for a moment, then gave a slight nod. Erilyn came by often, more so than usual these past few months. She seemed distracted, even obsessed, especially with the old town ledgers from the 1800s. She'd sit for hours on end, sifting through records of family names, property disputes, even death certificates. He hesitated, lowering his voice. Rumor has it she was trying to piece together a pattern. A pattern of what? Zephyr pressed. That's the question, Torin replied with a shrug. But I'll say this. Whatever it was, it rattled her. She became secretive. Once, she even snapped at me when I asked if she needed help. Zephyr thanked Torin, his mind racing with the possibilities. What could Erilyn have been trying to uncover that would make her so guarded? Her interests had always leaned towards historical curiosity, but this sounded more like she was onto something big, something worth hiding. As Zephyr returned to the library, the cryptic call number replayed in his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just a random book she had pointed him toward. Driven by the mysterious message, he revisited the shelves, sifting through books near the one he'd pulled the day before. His attention drifted to another leather-bound volume that bore no library tag, its cover weathered and worn. When he opened it, a small, handwritten note slipped out from between the pages. In Erilyn's unmistakable handwriting, it read, "For those who seek, only the past holds the key." The note was as vague as the first one he'd found, but this time, it felt purposeful. Zephyr took a deep breath, reading the line over and over. Perhaps Erilyn had hidden more clues within the library, or maybe even in the archives she frequented. She seemed to be leaving a trail, but to what? Zephyr's thoughts swirled with possibilities. He felt compelled to bring this new clue to Officer Seelan Fallow, the local police officer who had so easily dismissed Erilyn's death. He found Kaelin at the town's cafe, nursing a coffee with his usual detached expression. "Seelan, can I have a word?" Zephyr asked, pulling up a chair across from him. Seelan raised an eyebrow. "Another theory about Erilyn's passing?" "Yes," Zephyr said firmly, producing the note he'd found. "I think there's more to this than we realize. She left these clues on purpose. She was trying to tell us something." Kaelin glanced at the note, his skepticism barely masked. "Zephyr, I understand she was a friend, but people leave things behind all the time. It doesn't mean she was murdered. Grief can make us see patterns where there aren't any." Frustration welled up within Zephyr. But she specifically called it a clue to her murder. That can't be a coincidence. Kaelin sighed, setting his coffee down. "Look, Zephyr, you can play detective all you want, but unless you find something concrete, there's no investigation here. People in Shadowmere die. Not every death is a conspiracy." Zephyr left the cafe feeling dismissed, but he knew in his heart that something was off. He resolved to continue his search, determined to prove that Erilyn's death wasn't as simple as Kaelin believed. That evening, alone in the library, Zephyr continued searching through books Erilyn had recently checked out. After hours of flipping through volumes with no success, his fingers brushed across the worn cover of an old journal, tucked discreetly between two larger books. Opening it, he saw that it was Erilyn's personal journal, filled with entries dating back several years. As he skimmed through the pages, one entry stood out, dated just 2 weeks before her death. I found pieces of a story that was meant to be buried, secrets of people who walked these streets long before us. If I'm right, I may not have much time, but the truth is too important to stay hidden. The entry ended abruptly, as if she'd been interrupted, and Zephyr's mind raced with questions. What was the story Erlyn had uncovered? What secrets lay beneath the surface of Shadowmere? As he closed the journal, Zephyr's resolve grew. This wasn't just a matter of finding justice for a friend. Whatever Erlyn had discovered, it was something she deemed worth risking her life for. In her cryptic messages, Erlyn had hinted that only the past held the key. Zephyr thought back to the history of Shadowmere, the silent monuments of its older buildings, the gravestones in the forgotten cemetery, and the names that had faded with time. Somewhere within this town's history, she had found a truth someone wanted to keep buried. As he locked up the library and stepped into the moonlit streets, Zephyr knew there was no turning back. He was determined to follow Erlyn's trail of clues, even if it meant putting himself in danger. He would do whatever it took to uncover the truth. The following day, Zephyr returned to the library with a renewed sense of purpose. Erlyn's clues were leading him somewhere deeper, and he felt there was more hidden within these walls. Despite years of visiting, he'd never ventured into the old basement archives, a place Erlyn had mentioned only in passing. He made his way down the narrow staircase, his footsteps echoing off the stone walls as he entered the dimly lit basement. Dust hung thick in the air, and the scent of aged paper and mildew clung to every corner. Rows of metal shelves stretched out before him, each filled with forgotten records, obscure tomes, and relics from Shadowmere's past. As he wandered the basement, Zephyr spotted a set of cabinets labeled Confidential Records. They were locked, but with a tug, he realized the lock was old and weak. After a moment of struggle, the cabinet door creaked open. Inside were documents dated over a century ago, each detailing events and people long buried by time. Among them was a thick envelope marked the Silent Archivists. Zephyr opened the envelope carefully, revealing brittle papers and faded photographs. The name the Silent Archivists repeated throughout, mentioning a group of townsfolk dedicated to preserving and hiding particular aspects of Shadowmere's history. Members appeared to be community elites, people who used their influence to shape the town's story, often erasing those who opposed them or threatened their secrecy. One document mentioned a former member, Isolde Whitford, who had mysteriously disappeared after questioning the group's intentions. Another page held a list of names, several of whom Zephyr recognized as ancestors of present-day residents, including Erlyn's own surname, Bannister. Zephyr's heart raced. He could sense he was on the edge of something larger than himself, something that could explain why Erlyn had been so invested in this history, and why she might have been silenced. Just as Zephyr was gathering the documents to examine them more closely, he heard footsteps on the stairs. He quickly shoved the papers back into the cabinet, closing it just as Ambrose Darrow, the rare book dealer, appeared in the doorway. "Zephyr," Ambrose greeted smoothly, though his eyes narrowed with suspicion. "Didn't expect to find you down here. It's been a while since anyone's been through these archives." Zephyr forced a calm expression. "I thought I'd take a look around. Erlyn left some cryptic messages, and I felt like I owed it to her to follow up." Ambrose studied him for a long moment. Erlyn had a tendency to delve too deep. Some things are better left untouched, wouldn't you agree? Zephyr shrugged, masking his unease. "Depends on what's being hidden." Ambrose gave a thin smile. "Just remember, history doesn't always appreciate those who dig too eagerly." With that, he turned and strode back up the stairs, leaving Zephyr alone, yet more unsettled than ever. The presence of Ambrose in the basement seemed like more than a coincidence. It was a warning. Once Ambrose had gone, Zephyr returned to the documents, noting down each name from the Silent Archivists and the locations mentioned in the group's activities. Most of the places corresponded to landmarks around Shadowmere, including the old cemetery and the derelict estate on the town's outskirts. As he pieced together the locations, Zephyr noticed that they formed a circle around the library, as though the library itself were at the heart of this hidden history. It struck him that maybe Erilyn had figured this out too, and that her clues were leading him toward a revelation she had hoped to uncover herself. Feeling both excitement and dread, Zephyr resolved to explore the cemetery that evening. Perhaps the gravestones and records would hold the next piece of the puzzle. At dusk, Zephyr found himself at the edge of the Shadowmere cemetery, a sprawling, eerie place filled with weather-worn gravestones and crypts. The mist rolled across the ground, curling around the graves as he made his way down the cobblestone path, each step echoing in the silence. He walked along the rows, noting the names engraved on the stones, many of them matching the names he'd seen in the Silent Archivists' documents. A specific plot near the back of the cemetery caught his attention. A collection of small, unmarked graves, each one weathered and neglected. It was here that he found a stone with a faint inscription: Isolde Whitford, 1853. The lack of a death date unnerved him. It was as though her life had simply been cut out of history, left unresolved and forgotten. He wondered if Isolde, like Erilyn, had been silenced for what she knew. As he stood there, a rustling sound came from behind one of the larger crypts. He froze, heart pounding, only to see the familiar face of Jessamine Everhart emerge from the shadows. "Zephyr?" she called softly. "What are you doing out here?" "I could ask you the same thing," Zephyr replied, trying to keep his voice steady. Jessamine's face was pale, and she clutched a worn book tightly to her chest. "I've been reading Erilyn's journal. I think she knew more about this place than we realize." She paused, glancing around as though afraid someone might overhear. "There's something she wrote about protecting the truth, no matter the cost." She was afraid, Zephyr. Zephyr exchanged a wary glance with her, feeling the weight of the mystery deepen. If Jessamine was telling the truth, then Erilyn's research had frightened even her most trusted friend. Together, they sat on a bench at the edge of the cemetery, away from the graves. Jessamine opened the journal to a specific entry, dated just days before Erilyn's death. "To anyone who reads this, know that some secrets were meant to stay buried. But if you choose to unearth them, be prepared to face the consequences." Zephyr felt a chill as he read the words, their ominous tone confirming what he'd suspected. Erilyn had known she was in danger, yet she hadn't stopped her search. She'd left the clues intentionally, hoping someone else would pick up where she left off. "What do you think she was trying to protect?" Zephyr asked Jessamine, his voice barely above a whisper. Jessamine shook her head. "I don't know, but I think it has to do with the old families of Shadowmere, the ones who tried to erase anyone who got too close to the truth." She hesitated, her eyes dark with fear. Erilyn believed that the Silent Archivists were still around, that they had found a way to survive, even after all these years. They walked back to the library in silence, each lost in their thoughts. Zephyr couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching them as they passed through the town. The mist hung heavy around them, and every shadow seemed to pulse with hidden threats. As they reached the library's entrance, Jessamine stopped and gripped Zephyr's arm, her face drawn with concern. "Zephyr, you have to be careful. If the Silent Archivists really do still exist, they won't hesitate to do what they've done before." Zephyr nodded, feeling the weight of the warning settle into his bones. This was no longer just about solving Erilyn's death. It was about unearthing a dangerous truth that had claimed lives before. That night, back in his cottage, Zephyr pored over the notes he'd gathered, tracing the lineages of Shadowmere's prominent families and searching for connections between the names. He noticed something chilling. Several people who had disappeared in the late 1800s, all had ties to the Silent Archivists. They were not just archivists, they were enforcers of their own version of history, willing to erase anyone who threatened their legacy. Suddenly, a knock at his door shattered the silence. He froze, heart hammering. Glancing at the clock, he saw it was nearly midnight. Who would come at this hour? Slowly, he approached the door and opened it, only to find a plain white envelope lying on the doorstep. Inside was a single piece of paper bearing the familiar call number from Erilyn's email, followed by a message. "Curiosity killed the cat. Consider this your first and last warning." The threat only deepened Zephyr's resolve. He couldn't abandon Erilyn now, not when he was so close. The words of the warning burned in his mind, but he knew he would not be deterred. This wasn't just about honoring a friend's memory. It was about exposing a truth that had been buried for too long. He spent the rest of the night organizing his findings, preparing himself for what lay ahead. The pieces were coming together, and he sensed that the true danger was only just beginning. Whatever Erlen had discovered was still out there, hidden in the shadows of Shadowmere, waiting to be brought into the light. After a sleepless night, Zephyr returned to the library, resolute. The mysterious warning he'd received only made him more determined to see this through. But as he stepped through the library's entrance, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. He started to look around carefully, taking note of anyone acting out of place. That's when he spotted Jessamine Everhart again, standing by the shelves with an uneasy look. She caught his gaze and offered a half smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. Zephyr approached her cautiously. "Jessamine, I know you were close to Erlen. I can't stop wondering if there's more to this than we understand. Have you found anything else in her journal?" Jessamine's face paled slightly, but she shook her head. "No, I haven't, Zephyr. I wish I had." Her voice trembled slightly, and he noticed her hand clutching the journal so tightly her knuckles were white. Something felt wrong, but he couldn't quite place it. Jessamine seemed scared, almost as if she knew more than she was willing to say. He decided not to push her, but he made a mental note to keep an eye on her. She might be withholding information that could be crucial to unraveling Erlen's death. Later that day, Zephyr went to visit Ambrose Darrow at his small, cluttered shop on the outskirts of town. The walls were lined with shelves overflowing with rare books and documents, some stacked haphazardly on the floor. Ambrose glanced up from his desk as Zephyr entered, his gaze as guarded as ever. "Zephyr," he greeted, his voice measured. "To what do I owe this visit?" Zephyr didn't bother with pleasantries. "I need to know what you were doing in the library basement yesterday. You seemed interested in something down there." Ambrose smirked, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of annoyance. "I was merely indulging my curiosity. The library holds treasures most people overlook, wouldn't you agree? Were you interested in the Silent Archivists?" Zephyr pressed, watching closely for any reaction. Ambrose's expression tightened just a bit, but he quickly regained his composure. "I've heard the rumors, of course, but honestly, Zephyr, it's nothing more than the stuff of small-town legends." Zephyr didn't believe him. Ambrose was too knowledgeable about Shadowmere's history to dismiss something like the Silent Archivists so easily. He left the shop, more convinced than ever that Ambrose was hiding something, and that he might even be part of the shadowy group himself. That evening, Zephyr found Jessamine waiting for him on his doorstep. She looked anxious, her fingers twisting nervously around the edge of her scarf. "I have to talk to you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I wasn't entirely honest earlier about Erlen's journal." Zephyr gestured for her to come inside, and they sat together at his small kitchen table. Jessamine pulled out Erlen's journal, flipping to a page she hadn't shown him before. The entry was short but chilling. "If I disappear, trust only Zephyr. Everyone else has their own agenda." Zephyr looked up at Jessamine, stunned. She trusted me, but she thought others were against her? Jessamine nodded, her eyes filled with fear. Erlen started getting paranoid in the weeks before her death. She believed someone was watching her, and she thought she was getting too close to something dangerous. Zephyr's mind raced. If Erlen hadn't trusted anyone but him, then there was a real possibility that the people closest to her, including Jessamine herself, could be involved in her murder. He decided he'd have to keep a close eye on everyone around him, including Jessamine. As Jessamine was about to leave, a loud knock on the door startled them both. Zephyr opened it cautiously, only to find a small envelope on the ground. He picked it up and opened it with trembling hands, revealing a typed note inside. "Stop now, or you'll meet the same fate as Erlen." Jessamine gasped when she saw the note. "This is real, Zephyr. Someone wants us to stop looking into this." Zephyr clenched his fists, anger flaring within him. "Then we must be getting close to something important. They're afraid of what we'll uncover." Jessamine looked pale, but she nodded. "We have to be careful, Zephyr. Erlen was brave, but she ended up dead. We can't let that happen to us." Despite her warning, Zephyr felt more resolute than ever. He would find out the truth, no matter what it took. Zephyr decided to search through the library one more time, looking for anything that might provide a clue to Erlen's research. He returned to the basement, flashlight in hand, and began sifting through stacks of old documents and books. Hours passed, and just as he was beginning to lose hope, he came across a file folder that seemed out of place. It was labeled, "Confidential Records, Do Not Remove." Inside, he found several pages detailing mysterious disappearances and unexplained deaths in Shadowmere, all dating back over a century. One name stood out: Isolde Whitford. He remembered seeing her gravestone in the cemetery, the one with no death date. According to the file, Isolde had been one of the founding members of the Silent Archivists, but had attempted to leave the group after a falling out with its leader. Soon after, she vanished, and her death had never been officially recorded. Zephyr's pulse quickened. Isolde's fate sounded eerily similar to Erlen's. It was becoming clear that anyone who got too close to the truth risked their life. He snapped pictures of the documents with his phone, determined to keep a record in case anything happened to him. On his way back from the library, Zephyr felt a strange sense of unease, as though he were being followed. He quickened his pace, glancing over his shoulder, but saw no one. As he neared his cottage, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was Keelan Fallow, the police officer who had dismissed Erlen's death as natural. Keelan looked at him with a hard expression, crossing his arms as he blocked Zephyr's path. "Late night, Zephyr," he said in a voice that was just a little too calm. "You're spending a lot of time digging into things that don't concern you." Zephyr forced himself to stay composed. "Erlen was my friend. I owe it to her to find out the truth." Keelan's gaze darkened. "Sometimes, the truth is best left buried. People around here don't take kindly to those who disrupt the peace." With that, Keelan turned and walked away, leaving Zephyr standing in the street, shaken. He realized that the threat was closer than he'd anticipated, and that those in power in Shadowmere might be willing to go to any lengths to keep their secrets. The next morning, Zephyr met with Torrin Voss, the town archivist, whom he felt might be a potential ally. He explained Erlen's research and his discoveries about the Silent Archivists, hoping Torrin would be able to provide further insight. Torrin's face turned grave as he listened. "I knew Erlen was onto something, but I didn't realize it was this serious." The Silent Archivists were never just historians. They were protectors of a hidden truth and enforcers of a code that kept that truth safe. Anyone who got too close, well, you've seen what happens. Zephyr leaned forward. But why would they still exist now? What are they hiding that's so important? Torrin hesitated. There's a legend, a story about a powerful figure who once controlled the town. He left behind a treasure, or perhaps it was a weapon. The archivists are sworn to keep it hidden. If Erlen got too close, that may have been her undoing. With this new information, Zephyr knew where he needed to go next. The Whitford estate, on the edge of Shadowmere. The rumored final resting place of the so-called hidden treasure. If Erlen had been looking for it, it might have been the reason she was killed. As night fell, he made his way to the estate, a decaying mansion half buried in ivy and shrouded in mist. The silence was oppressive as he entered, his flashlight flickering across cracked walls and broken furniture. In the center of the room was an old chest, its lock rusted. He pried it open, only to find a single book inside, a family ledger with entries dating back to the 1800s. He flipped through the pages, scanning for anything unusual, when a folded letter slipped out. It was addressed to Isolde Whitford, written by a former Silent Archivist, warning her of the consequences of leaving the group. The letter ended with a chilling line: "Those who betray us pay the price. The Silent Archivists do not forgive, and they do not forget." As Zephyr closed the book, a renewed sense of urgency gripped him. The secrets buried within Shadowmere's history were deadly, but he was more determined than ever to expose them. He took the letter as proof, knowing it could be the key to bringing down the Silent Archivists. He realized he'd reached a point of no return. Erlen had left a trail that only he could follow, and he owed it to her memory to see this through, no matter the risks. As he left the Whitford estate, he knew he was in deeper than ever. The final chapters of Erlen's story were drawing near, and with each step he was closer to unearthing the truth and to exposing Shadowmere's darkest secrets. The next day, Zephyr returned to the library, his mind focused on Erlen's clues and the mysterious Silent Archivists. If there was more to uncover, he knew it would be hidden within these walls. He'd gone over every section of the library he could think of, but one area still eluded him: the restricted section. A narrow hallway, tucked away on the second floor, marked by a heavy wooden door. Normally, only staff had access to this part of the library. But with Erlen gone, Zephyr had little regard for rules. He found an old set of keys in Erlen's desk, one of which bore a faded label reading, "Restricted." His pulse quickened as he approached the door, and with a hesitant breath he unlocked it and slipped inside. The room was dark and musty, filled with old documents, rare books, and an entire wall of filing cabinets, each marked with coded labels. He shone his flashlight over them, realizing that this was Erlen's hidden archive, records she'd kept, seemingly without the knowledge of the library or the town. Here, he felt sure he would find what Erlen had discovered. As Zephyr rifled through the cabinets, he found an old leather-bound volume, embossed with the title, Records of the Silent Archivists, 1854 to present. He opened it, his fingers trembling with anticipation. The book detailed the origins of the Archivists, describing how the group was founded to protect the integrity of Shadowmere and its hidden wealth. Zephyr's eyes scanned the pages, taking in the names of the founding members, including Isolde Whitford, whose fate he had already partially uncovered. The records hinted that the Archivists were more than guardians of the town's history. They were manipulators, shaping events and erasing individuals who threatened their control. Each generation inducted new members, often from the town's elite families, who carried out secretive duties to protect their legacy. But one entry, dated over a century ago, chilled him to the bone. It read, "To silence is mercy, to forget is eternal. Those who oppose the Archivists shall vanish without trace." Zephyr felt his stomach turn. This was more than just a historical society. It was a group willing to kill to protect their secrets. As he dug deeper into the archive, Zephyr came across a series of recent entries, ones that had been meticulously handwritten by Erlen herself. She'd been recording her findings on the Archivists, detailing a timeline of disappearances in Shadowmere. Each entry followed a pattern. Every few decades, someone vanished, almost always after digging too deep into the town's past. One name stood out: Evadne Rayburn. In her notes, Erlen had written about her suspicions that Evadne, despite being a fellow bibliophile, might have connections to the Silent Archivists. She'd speculated that Evadne's family had ties to the Archivists dating back generations, and that Evadne herself might be actively involved. Zephyr's hands trembled as he considered what this meant. Had Evadne known about Erlen's research and worked against her? And if so, was she responsible for Erlen's death? Zephyr felt a sudden need to confirm his suspicions, and his thoughts turned to Evadne. That evening, he watched from a hidden vantage point near the library's entrance, waiting to see if Evadne or any other potential Archivist members would appear. Just as the town's clock tower struck midnight, he spotted her. Evadne, hurrying down the street, her figure shrouded in a long coat. She glanced around, making sure she wasn't being followed, before slipping into a small, dimly lit shop at the end of the street, Ambrose Darrow's rare bookstore. Realization dawned on Zephyr as he crept closer, peering through the shop's dusty window. Inside, he could see Evadne speaking with Ambrose, her voice tense. Though he couldn't make out the words, it was clear they were discussing something important, and that something was troubling them both. His suspicions were all but confirmed. Evadne and Ambrose were in league, members of the Silent Archivists, actively working to silence anyone who threatened their secrets. Zephyr rushed back to his cottage, heart pounding. He'd have to confront Jessamine, the only person he'd shared his findings with, but now he feared that her loyalty might lie with the Archivists as well. He hesitated as he dialed her number, but her voice, warm and familiar, put him somewhat at ease. They met at a secluded bench near the edge of town, the night's chill settling over them as he explained everything he'd found, holding nothing back. Jessamine's face was a mixture of horror and disbelief as she listened, her hands trembling. Do you really think Evadne and Ambrose are involved?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Zephyr nodded grimly. "I don't just think so. I know it. I saw them meeting late at night, whispering about something. They're keeping secrets, and they're willing to do anything to protect them. Jessamine's eyes darted around nervously. We have to be careful, Zephyr. If they're truly part of this society, they'll stop at nothing to silence us. Zephyr felt a surge of determination. Then we need to act quickly, before they come for us too. The following night, Zephyr decided to use the library as a trap, hoping to draw out the archivists. He and Jessamine carefully staged the scene, leaving key documents from Erlen's archive out in plain view, including the folder labeled Silent Archivists. They hoped to catch Evadne or Ambrose sneaking in to retrieve or destroy the evidence. Hours passed, and midnight came and went. Just as Zephyr was beginning to doubt anyone would show, he heard the faint sound of footsteps. He and Jessamine stayed hidden in the shadows as the library door creaked open. Evadne entered, her face shrouded in determination as she moved toward the desk where they'd left the documents. She reached for the folder, her eyes darting over the pages, scanning the words with an expression of controlled fury. Zephyr stepped out from his hiding place, confronting her. Looking for something, Evadne? She froze, but only for a moment. Her expression hardened and she straightened, meeting his gaze with an icy glare. You don't understand, Zephyr. There are things in this town that must remain hidden. Erlen was foolish to think she could change that. Zephyr's voice shook with anger. You killed her, didn't you? You and the archivists? Evadne's silence was answer enough. Her eyes, cold and unrepentant, told him everything he needed to know. As they confronted Evadne, a shadow moved near the library entrance. Ambrose stepped into the room, his face grim. He closed the door behind him, trapping Zephyr and Jessamine in the room. You should have stayed out of this, Zephyr, Ambrose said, his voice low and threatening. Erlen's curiosity cost her everything. You'll find the same fate awaits those who defy the Silent Archivists. Zephyr's heart raced, but he refused to back down. I don't care about your secrets. This town deserves the truth. People deserve to know what you've done. Ambrose and Evadne exchanged a glance, one filled with understanding and mutual resolve. Then you leave us no choice, Evadne replied, her voice as cold as steel. Before Zephyr could react, Jessamine stepped forward, putting herself between him and the archivists. Please, there must be another way. We can work together to protect the town. Zephyr felt a wave of disbelief as he realized that Jessamine's words held a hidden plea, one not directed at him but at Ambrose and Evadne. His heart sank as it dawned on him that she was in league with them, using his trust to lead him into a trap. Jessamine turned to him, her eyes filled with regret. I didn't want it to be this way, Zephyr, but some secrets must be protected. Zephyr's betrayal stung, but he held his ground, even as Jessamine, his last ally, slipped away from him. You're making a mistake, Jessamine. They won't spare you if you cross them. In the tense silence that followed, Zephyr saw his opportunity. He darted toward the emergency exit, slamming it open before Evadne or Ambrose could react. He raced out into the night, the cold air stinging his face, his heart pounding. Behind him, he heard footsteps as they pursued him. The darkness swallowed the streets of Shadowmere, and he knew he'd have to use every bit of his knowledge of the town to escape. He cut through alleyways, winding around hidden paths, finally reaching his cottage. There he barricaded himself, panting and exhausted, his mind racing with the realization that he was now a marked man. With no one left to trust, Zephyr was alone, determined to bring the truth of the Silent Archivists to light. Zephyr huddled inside his cottage, the night stretching on as he replayed the events at the library in his mind. He was now completely alone, with no one left to trust. Jessamine's betrayal stunned the most, and he found it hard to shake the image of her turning away from him, choosing the Silent Archivists over him. Zephyr knew he needed to regroup. The Archivists were powerful, but he had the last pieces of evidence that could expose them. He carefully laid out all of Erlen's notes, photos of the documents he'd taken from the library, and the letter from Isolde Whitford he'd found at the Whitford estate. He would need to analyze each detail, every hidden line, for something that could give him the upper hand. As dawn broke, Zephyr received an unexpected knock on his door. Cautious, he peered through the window to see Torrin Voss, the town archivist who had shared information about the Silent Archivists' origins. Although wary, Zephyr opened the door and let him in. Torin looked around nervously, his eyes settling on the notes scattered across the table. I heard what happened last night, Zephyr. Word travels fast in Shadowmere. Zephyr clenched his fists, anger simmering beneath his calm exterior. I don't know who to trust anymore, Torin. Everyone seems to be in on this. Torin held up his hands in reassurance. Not everyone. I'm not. Erilyn and I discussed these things before, but I was too afraid to act. When I heard they were after you, I knew I had to help. Zephyr felt a glimmer of hope. Then help me finish what Erilyn started. If we can reveal their secrets, the Archivists won't be able to control this town any longer. Torin nodded, his face set with determination. Then we'd better move quickly. There's an old section of the archives that the Archivists tried to erase from public record. If there's any proof of their influence, it'll be there. With Torin's guidance, Zephyr returned to the library under the cover of darkness. Torin led him to a secluded part of the archives where few people ventured. A section hidden behind a heavy wooden shelf that had once served as a false wall. After some effort, they managed to shift the shelf, revealing a narrow door behind it. Torin unlocked it with a key he'd found among Erilyn's belongings, and they stepped inside. The room was dark and cold, with only the dim light from Zephyr's flashlight illuminating rows of filing cabinets filled with records dating back to Shadowmere's earliest days. Zephyr noticed that many of the files were labeled with family names he recognized from Erilyn's notes. Whitford, Rayburn, Darrow. This room was the true archive of the Silent Archivists, containing records of every person who had crossed their path or come too close to their secrets. As Zephyr sifted through the records, he came across a small locked drawer labeled Bannister. His heart raced as he realized it was a file on Erilyn. Torin produced a small key he'd found hidden in Erilyn's desk, and they unlocked the drawer together. Inside, they found a single sheet of paper with one final message scrawled in Erilyn's handwriting. The Archivists protect something greater than history, something that could destroy us all if revealed. Trust only in the truth, Zephyr. Finish what I could not. Zephyr felt a shiver run down his spine. Erilyn's words left him with more questions than answers, but they also filled him with a renewed sense of purpose. Whatever the Archivists were hiding, it was more dangerous than he'd ever imagined. Zephyr continued searching through the cabinets, finally coming across an ancient, leather-bound ledger labeled the Shadowmere Covenant. It contained names and dates, each entry marking someone who had either joined the Archivists or been erased from Shadowmere's history. The ledger confirmed Erilyn's theory. The Archivists were not just protectors of history. They were enforcers of silence. Every few years, they would eliminate anyone who threatened their carefully curated version of Shadowmere's past. Toward the end of the ledger, he found a more recent entry, Erilyn Bannister. Next to her name was a chilling notation, elimination confirmed. Zephyr felt a wave of nausea. They had not only planned her death but documented it as part of their twisted legacy. He clenched his fists, a fierce resolve filling him. He would make sure Erilyn's story, and the story of every victim of the Archivists, was brought to light. As they left the hidden archive, Torin and Zephyr returned to the main library area, only to find Ambrose Darrow waiting for them. His face was grim, his posture tense. "I warned you, Zephyr," Ambrose said, his voice filled with an icy calm. "Some things are best left hidden. You were given the chance to walk away." Zephyr held his ground, his voice defiant. "You can't control the truth forever, Ambrose. This town deserves to know what you and the Archivists have done." Ambrose sneered. "The Archivists have kept Shadowmere safe for centuries. We guard secrets that would destroy this town if exposed." Zephyr glared back undeterred. "That's just an excuse. Erilyn didn't die so you could keep your power. She wanted the truth to be free." For a moment, Ambrose's composure faltered, but he quickly regained his cold resolve. "You forced my hand, Zephyr. This ends tonight." Realizing the danger, Zephyr and Torin bolted for the exit, sprinting down the library's shadowy corridors as Ambrose gave chase. The library's once familiar walls now felt like a labyrinth, and every turn seemed to bring them closer to capture. They managed to slip out through a side door, emerging into the cold night air. Zephyr led Torin through the winding streets of Shadowmere, cutting down alleys and doubling back to shake off any followers. They finally took refuge in an old church at the edge of town, its massive stone walls offering a temporary sanctuary. As they caught their breath, Zephyr looked over at Torin. "We can't keep running. We need to get these documents out into the open, or Erlen's death will have been for nothing." Torin nodded, grim but determined. "I know someone in the next town over who could help us get this story to the press. It's risky, but it's our only chance." Back in town, Ambrose and Evadne regrouped. Furious and desperate, they made plans to intercept Zephyr and Torin before they could leave Shadowmere. They knew that if the documents reached the outside world, the entire legacy of the Silent Archivists would crumble. Ambrose turned to Evadne, his voice low and cold. "We can't let them escape. If we do, everything we've built will be ruined." Evadne's eyes glinted with a dangerous resolve. "Then we'll do whatever it takes. Shadowmere must be preserved." They set out into the night, rallying other members of the Archivists to assist in the hunt. The town was no longer just a home. It was a fortress, and they intended to use every resource at their disposal to trap Zephyr and Torin before they could expose the truth. Meanwhile, in the safety of the church, Zephyr and Torin devised a plan to get the documents to safety. They decided Torin would leave at first light, taking the hidden archive files to his contact in the nearby town, while Zephyr would create a diversion, drawing the Archivists' attention away from Torin's escape. Zephyr felt a weight settle over him, knowing the danger he was about to face. But he also felt Erlen's presence beside him, as though she were urging him forward. He wouldn't let her down. As dawn approached, Zephyr left the church, deliberately making his way through the town square, where he knew the Archivists would spot him. Sure enough, within moments, he heard footsteps approaching from all directions. Ambrose and Evadne stepped out of the shadows, their expressions a mixture of anger and triumph. "This is the end of the line, Zephyr," Ambrose declared, his voice deadly calm. But Zephyr met their gaze with unflinching determination. "You can silence me, but you can't bury the truth. Erlen's story will live on, and so will the truth about the Silent Archivists." Ambrose sneered, but his confidence faltered as he noticed the glint of resolve in Zephyr's eyes. He knew then that Zephyr had already set something in motion that he couldn't stop. As dawn broke over Shadowmere, Torin crept out of the church's rear exit, clutching the files he and Zephyr had gathered. His heart pounded as he navigated the winding streets, keeping to the shadows. He knew Zephyr was creating a diversion, but he still couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were on him. The town felt unnaturally quiet. The usual morning routine of vendors setting up their stalls and townsfolk milling about was absent, leaving only a sense of foreboding. Torin moved with quick, calculated steps, heading toward the old path leading to the outskirts of Shadowmere. If he could reach the woods and make it to the next town, he'd be safe. But he knew this was just the beginning of the ordeal. In the town square, Zephyr made himself visible, pacing deliberately under the dim street lamps. He wanted the Archivists to find him, to focus all their attention on him so that Torin could slip away unnoticed. His resolve was unwavering. This was his only chance to ensure Erlen's story would be told. Soon enough, he spotted Ambrose Darrow and Evadne Rayburn, flanked by two other members of the Silent Archivists. They approached with calm, controlled steps, their expressions a mix of contempt and cold determination. "Do you really think you can just walk out of here, Zephyr?" Ambrose sneered, his voice laced with venom. "You have no idea what you're up against." Zephyr met his gaze without flinching. "I know exactly what I'm up against, but unlike you, I'm not afraid of the truth." Ambrose's eyes narrowed and he exchanged a look with Evadne, who took a step forward, her voice chillingly calm. "You've meddled with things you don't understand, Zephyr. This isn't just about history, it's about the very survival of Shadowmere." Zephyr laughed bitterly. "You call it survival. I call it a lie built on fear. People deserve to know the truth." Evadne's eyes flashed with fury, and she signaled to the others. "Enough. End this." Zephyr bolted, darting through the streets as the Archivists pursued him. He could feel their footsteps closing in, but he refused to slow down, drawing them farther from the path Torin was taking. He twisted and turned through Shadowmere's narrow alleyways, his breath coming in short bursts as he forced himself onward. The pursuit led him through Shadowmere's back streets, into the forested outskirts, where he could use the thick trees for cover. The fog hung low, swirling around him as he ducked behind tree trunks, pausing only to catch his breath and throw off his pursuers. He knew the landscape well enough to stay ahead, but he also knew it was only a matter of time before they closed in. Meanwhile, Torin continued along the path, pushing himself toward the neighboring town. His mind raced with the weight of what he was carrying, the final pieces of evidence that could dismantle the Silent Archivists' hold over Shadowmere. He kept glancing over his shoulder, half expecting to see the Archivists appear out of nowhere. As he neared the forest's edge, he heard footsteps approaching. Panic surged through him, but he forced himself to stay calm, remembering Zephyr's words. "You're the only one who can make sure the truth gets out." Summoning every ounce of courage, he pressed on, determined to reach his contact in the neighboring town and deliver the documents that would end the Archivists' reign. Back in the woods, Zephyr's strength began to wane as he maneuvered through the fog-laden trees. His pursuers closed in, surrounding him in a small clearing. Ambrose and Evadne emerged from the shadows, their faces grim with resolve. "It's over, Zephyr," Ambrose said, his voice echoing through the silent trees. "No one's coming to save you." Zephyr straightened, facing them with defiance. "You can silence me, but the truth won't die with me. Torin has everything he needs to expose you." Evadne's face twisted in anger, and she stepped forward, her voice low and threatening. "We should have dealt with you sooner. You were never meant to be part of this." Zephyr held his ground, his voice unwavering. "You've built your lives on lies and secrets, but they won't protect you forever. Erilyn believed in the truth, and so do I." Ambrose shook his head, almost pityingly. "You're a fool, Zephyr. You think exposing us will make the town better, but it will only bring chaos. We've preserved Shadowmere for generations. This town depends on the order we maintain." Zephyr felt a surge of anger and frustration. "That's a lie. You've controlled people with fear and silence. Erilyn didn't deserve what you did to her, and neither did anyone else." Suddenly, one of the Archivists lunged at Zephyr, catching him off guard. He fought back with everything he had, grappling with his attacker as they struggled for control. The other Archivist circled him, watching with grim determination, waiting for him to weaken. Despite the odds, Zephyr managed to push his attacker away, grabbing a fallen branch as a makeshift weapon. He swung it wildly, backing toward the edge of the clearing, refusing to let them corner him. The fierce determination in his eyes gave him strength as he fought for his life. But his strength was waning, and he knew he couldn't hold them off forever. The Archivists advanced with chilling calm, their expressions devoid of sympathy. They were fully prepared to end his life if it meant protecting their secrets. Meanwhile, Torin reached the neighboring town just as dawn began to break. Exhausted and breathless, he found his contact, a journalist named Idalia Penrose, waiting at the train station. Idalia took one look at Torin's disheveled appearance and understood the urgency. "Do you have the files?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Torin nodded, handing her the documents. "This is everything. Names, dates, proof of every cover-up and murder the Archivists committed." Idalia glanced through the documents, her eyes widening with shock. This will shake Shadowmere to its core." Torin nodded, the weight of relief finally sinking in. "Make sure everyone knows. They can't keep their secrets any longer." Idalia promised she would publish the story, and Torin watched as she disappeared into the crowd, carrying the truth with her. He knew it was now up to Zephyr to survive and see the story reach its conclusion. Back in the clearing, Zephyr was cornered, his energy nearly depleted. Ambrose and Evadne stood over him, their expressions hardened, ready to deliver the final blow. Zephyr met their gaze with defiance, refusing to show fear. "You may silence me," he said, his voice strong despite his exhaustion, "but you can't stop the truth. It's already out there, and soon everyone will know." Evadne's expression faltered, a flicker of doubt crossing her face. She glanced at Ambrose, uncertainty clouding her features. But Ambrose's face remained cold, his mind made up. "It ends here," Ambrose said, raising a heavy branch to strike. Just as he moved to swing, a loud rustling came from the trees, and a figure emerged from the shadows. Kaelin Fallow, the local police officer, armed and ready. Kaelin's voice cut through the tension. "Drop the branch, Ambrose. This ends now." Ambrose froze, his face twisted with fury. Kalen, you don't understand. This is about Shadowmere. We're protecting our town. Seelan shook his head. By murdering people? By covering up the truth? He turned to Zephyr, a hint of regret in his eyes. I should have listened to you sooner. With Kalen's intervention, the remaining archivists lowered their weapons, reluctantly stepping back. Ambrose glared at Seelan, his voice filled with bitterness. You'll regret this. Shadowmere will regret this. Keelan's gaze was unyielding. If the town regrets anything, it's being controlled by people like you. Ambrose and Evadne exchanged one last defiant look before Keelan escorted them out of the clearing. Zephyr watched, relief flooding through him as the weight of the night's events settled over him. As the sun rose over Shadowmere, Zephyr stood alone in the forest, exhausted but victorious. The truth was finally on its way to being revealed, and he knew Erilyn's legacy would live on. Her courage remembered by all who would read the story of the Silent Archivists. Zephyr walked back to town, his steps heavy but filled with a quiet resolve. He'd survived, and though the Archivist's influence had scarred Shadowmere, he felt hope that in time the town could begin to heal. He would carry Erilyn's story forward, honoring her memory and ensuring that the truth would not be forgotten. 2 days after Zephyr's escape and Torrhen's delivery, the story of the Silent Archivists hit the press. Every major news outlet within 100 miles published the explosive exposé, penned by Idalia Penrose. The article was thorough and damning, detailing each covert operation the archivists had carried out over the years. Disappearances, threats, and the recent murder of Erilyn Bannister. The townsfolk of Shadowmere read in shock as the dark history of their home was unveiled. For the first time, families saw the names of ancestors erased from history, victims of a legacy of silence. Rumors flew, and soon the quiet town was teeming with journalists, curious onlookers, and former townspeople, returning to learn the truth of what had happened to their kin. That afternoon, Zephyr returned to the library, feeling the weight of his journey. As he wandered through the aisles, he felt Erilyn's presence as vividly as if she were standing beside him. Her life's work, once hidden away in the dark recesses of the library, was now part of Shadowmere's story. Preserved and honored, he found himself drawn to her old desk, where she'd spent countless hours reading and cataloging, piecing together the history that had led to her death. In her memory, he placed a plaque on the desk, in memory of Erilyn Bannister, for her courage, her integrity, and her unyielding pursuit of truth. The plaque felt like a small gesture, but it symbolized the change sweeping through Shadowmere. People would remember her, and her courage would inspire generations to come. Zephyr found himself at the center of attention. People approached him at all hours, some expressing gratitude for his bravery, others grappling with the revelation that their own families had been complicit in the Archivists' activities. The once peaceful streets of Shadowmere were filled with tense conversations, and neighbors began to look at one another with suspicion. A group of townsfolk gathered in the town square, where Zephyr stood on the steps of the library, answering questions as best he could. Many looked to him for guidance, and he found himself in an unexpected role as both a leader and a spokesperson for Shadowmere's new future. But not all were supportive. Some of the town's oldest families, furious at the exposure, lashed out at Zephyr, accusing him of betraying his heritage. Evadne Rayburn, one of the ringleaders of the Silent Archivists, was particularly vocal, her voice filled with venom as she confronted him. You think you're a hero, Zephyr? All you've done is open Pandora's box. You have no idea what chaos you've unleashed, she hissed, her eyes cold. Zephyr met her gaze steadily. The truth is worth any cost, Evadne. You can't hide behind lies forever. Her expression twisted with anger, but she turned away, her influence over Shadowmere broken. The townsfolk began to turn their backs on her and others like her, no longer willing to be part of the Archivists' dark legacy. In the following weeks, the surviving members of the Silent Archivists, including Ambrose Darrow and Evadne Rayburn, were brought to trial. The evidence against them was overwhelming, thanks to the documents Torrhen had delivered. Public outrage was palpable, and the courtroom was filled with townsfolk demanding justice. One by one, former archivists were called to testify, exposing not only their own actions, but also the systemic corruption that had allowed the Silent Archivists to thrive. Some tried to justify their actions, claiming they had only wanted to protect Shadowmere's history. But the townspeople had no sympathy for them, and the courtroom resounded with murmurs of anger and disbelief. Avadni, once a respected figure, now sat in the defendant's chair, her face pale and drawn. Her final statement was bitter and defiant. "I did what was necessary. Without us, Shadowmere would have been lost to chaos." But the judge's response was firm. "The only chaos was what you created to maintain your power. The people of Shadowmere deserve to know their history without fear." With the archivist's convictions, Shadowmere's dark past was finally reckoned with. The surviving members were sentenced, their power dismantled, and their influence permanently erased. The town struggled in the weeks following the trial, as old secrets surfaced and families reconciled with their roles in the town's shadowed history. Yet, with each difficult conversation, a new sense of unity emerged among the townspeople. They were free from the oppressive control of the Silent Archivists, and for the first time, people felt empowered to explore their history openly, without fear. The library, once a place of hidden agendas, became a hub for learning and reflection. People flocked to its doors, eager to read the documents the archivists had tried to suppress. Zephyr worked with Torin and other volunteers to organize Erlen's notes, creating a section in the library dedicated to the truth of Shadowmere. Schools began to teach a more complete version of the town's history, one that acknowledged the archivist's influence and honored the resilience of those who had resisted it. A memorial was erected in the town square, honoring the names of those who had vanished at the archivist's hands, including Isolde Whitford and Erlen Bannister. One quiet evening, as Zephyr was locking up the library, Jessamine Everhart appeared, her face lined with remorse. She approached him cautiously, her expression one of regret and sadness. "Zephyr, I came to apologize. I was wrong. I should have stood by you and Erlen, but I was afraid. I let the archivists control me, and I betrayed everything I believed in." Zephyr regarded her with a mixture of empathy and sadness. "You're right, Jessamine. You did betray us, but fear is a powerful thing. Erlen would want me to forgive you, and so I will. But this town will need time to heal." Jessamine nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. "Thank you. I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make things right." They shared a quiet moment, the weight of the past finally beginning to lift as they each found a small measure of peace. Zephyr knew the path to healing would be long, but he also knew that forgiveness, however difficult, was a step toward rebuilding trust. On the anniversary of Erlen's death, the town gathered in the library to honor her legacy. Zephyr was invited to speak, and he stood at the front of the room, feeling the weight of her memory. "Erlen Bannister was more than just a librarian," he began, his voice filled with emotion. "She was a seeker of truth, a guardian of our history, and a friend to us all. Her courage brought us here today, and her story reminds us of the importance of honesty, even when it's painful." He paused, looking out at the faces of those gathered. "We owe it to her, and to ourselves, to ensure that no one else suffers for the truth. Shadowmere's history belongs to all of us, and it's up to us to protect it with integrity." The townsfolk clapped, some with tears in their eyes, as they honored the woman whose sacrifice had freed Shadowmere. The moment was somber, yet hopeful, and Zephyr felt Erlen's presence with him, a guiding light in the heart of the library. In the months that followed, Shadowmere began to change. New leaders emerged, dedicated to transparency and open dialogue. The library became a central meeting place where people discussed their ideas for the future, debating how to keep the town's history alive while ensuring it would never again be twisted for personal gain. Zephyr continued to work in the library, now regarded as one of Shadowmere's most respected figures. He took comfort in knowing that Erlen's legacy would live on through him and others who believed in the truth. On a quiet evening, he stood outside the library, watching the sun set over the town. Shadowmere had faced its darkest secrets and emerged, bruised but resilient. He knew there would always be challenges, but he felt a quiet pride in what they had achieved. As the last rays of light disappeared, Zephyr whispered a final promise to the memory of Erlen Bannister. "Your truth has set us free." A few weeks after the trial and public reckoning, Shadowmere had settled into a new rhythm. But for Zephyr, life hadn't quite returned to normal. He carried the weight of everything he'd uncovered, The loss of Erilyn, the betrayal of Jessamine, the venom of the Silent Archivists. He knew the town had changed for the better, yet he felt a profound sense of responsibility for all that had transpired. One evening, Zephyr wandered to the old cemetery on the outskirts of town, finding himself at Erilyn Bannister's grave. Her headstone, simple and elegant, bore the inscription he'd chosen for her. A guardian of truth, gone but not forgotten. Kneeling by her grave, Zephyr spoke softly, as if she could still hear him. I couldn't have done any of this without you, Erilyn. I only wish you could see the changes you inspired. He closed his eyes, feeling her presence in the quiet around him. He knew he'd done what she would have wanted, even if the cost had been high. In her memory, he resolved to continue his work, using the lessons she'd taught him to honor the truth, no matter how painful. After leaving the cemetery, Zephyr met Torin Voss at a small cafe, where they often discussed the ongoing changes in Shadowmere. Torin had become one of Zephyr's closest friends, their bond forged by the challenges they'd faced together. Torin took a sip of his coffee, studying Zephyr thoughtfully. You know, if it weren't for you, none of this would have happened. I doubt I would have had the courage to go through with it. Zephyr gave a small, self-deprecating smile. It didn't feel brave. I felt scared every step of the way, but Erilyn trusted me and I couldn't let her down. Torin nodded, his gaze steady. That's exactly why it worked. You weren't trying to be a hero, you just wanted to do what was right. They fell into a comfortable silence, both of them reflecting on the journey. For Zephyr, it was a rare moment of peace. He finally felt like he had someone who understood the complexity of what they'd done, the toll it had taken, and the uncertain future that lay ahead. Not long after, Zephyr found himself facing Jessamine Everhart once more. She'd been laying low since her public apology, and although he'd forgiven her, he hadn't truly resolved the sense of betrayal he still carried. Seeing her felt like facing a ghost, a remnant of the past he was trying to leave behind. Jessamine, he began carefully, I've been thinking about what happened. I understand why you were afraid, but it still hurt. You were the last person I thought would betray me. Jessamine looked down, guilt etched across her face. I know, Zephyr. I let fear guide me, and I'll regret that for the rest of my life. I thought I was protecting myself. I didn't realize how much I was hurting others. Zephyr let out a slow breath, feeling the weight of her words. It's hard to let go of that, but I don't want to carry anger forever. I've come to see that forgiveness is part of the truth we both need. Jessamine met his gaze, relief softening her expression. Thank you, Zephyr. I know I don't deserve it, but I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make things right. They shared a quiet mutual understanding, their friendship bruised but not entirely broken. Zephyr knew the path to trust would take time, but he was willing to try. In that moment, he felt a small measure of peace, a release from the bitterness that had lingered since the betrayal. In the following weeks, Zephyr reconnected with Shadowmere in a way he hadn't anticipated. The townspeople treated him with new respect, many approaching him to thank him for revealing the truth. Some shared stories about their families, tales that had once been hidden but were now being brought to light. One morning, he visited the library, where a group of students were reading from a display dedicated to Shadowmere's true history. It included stories of those who had opposed the Archivists, as well as Erilyn's own contributions to the town. The students looked up at Zephyr with admiration, asking him questions about his journey and the challenges he'd faced. Zephyr answered patiently, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. Watching the younger generation embrace the truth and learn from the mistakes of the past, he knew Erilyn's legacy was secure. Shadowmere was healing, and it filled him with hope for the future. One evening, Zephyr sat by his window, looking out over Shadowmere as the sun set, casting a warm glow over the town. He reflected on everything that had brought him to this moment: the fear, the betrayals, the quiet moments of determination, and the unyielding pursuit of truth. He realized that his journey hadn't just been about revealing the Archivist's secrets. It had been a journey of self-discovery, one that had forced him to confront his own fears and limitations. He had grown in ways he hadn't anticipated, becoming someone Erilyn would be proud of. Though he knew his life would never be the same, he felt a quiet satisfaction, a sense of accomplishment. The town would remember Erlen, and they would remember him as the one who helped uncover the truth. It was a legacy he hadn't sought, but one he was grateful for nonetheless. One day, Zephyr received a letter from Idalia Penrose, the journalist who had published the story. She expressed her admiration for his courage and offered him a chance to share his story with a wider audience. Idalia proposed a book, one that would delve into the history of Shadowmere, the Archivists, and Zephyr's own journey. Zephyr considered the idea, feeling both excitement and hesitation. Part of him longed to move forward, to leave the pain behind. But he also recognized the value in sharing the story, not just for himself, but for those who had suffered under the Archivists' control. After careful thought, he agreed. He would write the book, not for fame or recognition, but to honor the memories of Erlen, Isolde Whitford, and every soul who had been lost to the Archivists' cruelty. The months passed, and Zephyr's book took shape, capturing the haunting beauty of Shadowmere, the courage of those who had resisted the Archivists, and the personal journey he'd endured. Writing allowed him to process his experiences, transforming pain into a testament to resilience and truth. When the book was finally published, it was met with acclaim, not only in Shadowmere, but beyond. People across the region were captivated by the story, drawn to the mystery and the bravery of those who had fought for justice. The book became a symbol of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest of places, light could be found. On the one-year anniversary of the publication, Zephyr returned to Shadowmere's library for a reading and signing event. The room was filled with townsfolk, eager to celebrate the book and honor Erlen's memory. They gathered around Zephyr, sharing stories of their own connections to the town's history and expressing gratitude for his dedication. As he signed books and spoke with attendees, he felt a profound sense of closure. This journey had been difficult, but it had also given him a new sense of purpose. He would always carry the scars of his experience, but he knew now that those scars had made him stronger. When the event ended, Zephyr walked through the library one last time, lingering by Erlen's plaque. He placed his hand on it, a silent thank you to the woman who had inspired him and changed his life forever. "You did it, Erlen," he whispered, a bittersweet smile on his face. "We did it."